Still small voice cries out to my
Hey
soul.
everyone, it's MK. So I posted yesterday about the video that you're watching right now, and I dropped a little hint that I would do some sort of a little sim tip tutorial as it relates to pantographs. So I'm going to go inside a simulation and I'm going to give you just a few of my best tips and tricks and techniques for setting up pantographs. It's not going to be my full on pantograph class. You can check that out on my website. But I just want to give you a few little hints and tips as it related to this specific pattern. All right, join me in simulation. All right, here we are. Really quickly, what you're looking at on the screen is the actual original pattern that I was stitching. This is just as it comes from the designer. This is how I resized it before I went on to work with it like this. Okay, so the first thing I want to do before I really show you anything is just kind of talk you through what I do almost always on a complete edge-to-edge pantograph that I use in my studio. The first thing I do is I open the original from the designer and I try to determine if the default size is what I want to use. 9 times out of 10, I'm going to say it's not. I like to stitch my patterns a little bit tighter, maybe a little bit tighter than most, but that's just my personal preference. So I will usually size that pattern down and then I'll begin to work with it in simulation. Now, just as a way of a tip and technique that I have been using since the introduction of simulation, which has actually been 2 years now, my my best thing advice that I can tell you is when I first got simulation, one of the very first things that I did was use it to set up pantographs so that these pantographs were ready for me to use when I'm ready to stitch. So you don't really even have to know what size your quilt is going to be. I just set the pattern to a size that I know that I like because it's probably a pattern that I've used before and I kind of have an idea of how tight I want that to stitch, and that's how tight I want it to stitch most times. So I'll set it up that way and then I'll save it. And just let me show you really quickly in on my flash drive, I have a folder called Master Pantographs. Now there's some other things saved in here, but what I really wanted to show you was that generally speaking, what I have in my Master Pantograph folder is a master pattern, and then I have that pattern set up so that it's ready to go when I stitch. Okay, now some of the patterns I have set up a couple of different ways, like this one called Love, Peace, and Happiness. I have that set up at a couple of different heights. Okay, so sometimes I like to vary the size that I'm stitching it. But for the most part, if I have the master pattern and I have a pantograph set up ahead of time, then that's going to make my stitching go faster at the quilt. Okay, so I just populate this one flash drive with some of my favorite go-to pantographs, and then I always have it ready. Okay, so that's kind of the number one tip. Now the next thing I want to show you, and this isn't a full set pantograph because normally I set them up to be a little bit wider. But you're going to notice up at the top this pantograph is about 92, almost 93 inches wide as I have it set up here. Okay, now that's a pretty wide pantograph. That's going to cover most of what I'm going to be stitching. And if it's not, I can either make it a little bit bigger to accommodate my quilt, or I can just start over again, resize that pattern and set it up at a size that's going to cover a larger quilt. But basically I have this set, and at 92 inches or 93, it's going to cover most quilts. Now the other thing that you're going to notice is that my start points are on the right in this pattern. And you're probably thinking, gosh, Melissa, I normally start on the left. And I'm here to tell you that I normally start on the left also. But in this particular pattern, I had fixed this pattern in Art and Stitch to stitch in both directions. And sometimes when I go through those steps in Art and Stitch, it swaps the start and end. And I don't exactly know why it does that. I don't really care why it does that. But a lot of times when I get over to Pro Stitcher, and if it's on the right hand side, I will just go ahead and go under Modify, Rotate, and I will just whoops, not reposition, rotate, there we go. And I'll just mirror it around so that the start point is on the left. Now the thing about this pattern, and it's just a quirky little thing that is specific to me in this pattern, is I don't like the hearts stitching in this direction. Okay, I like them better in this orientation. So when I was stitching this quilt, I went ahead and left the start points on the right. It really doesn't matter if they're on the right or the left. The positioning is the same. And all of that instruction on how I do positioning using start points, again, is in my full-on best practices for Pantos class. But let's just, let me go ahead and close this workspace. And I just want to show you, let's see. Okay, so here is the pantograph once I actually started working with it at my customer's quilt. Okay, so you're going to notice up at the top that it's been cropped off at the edges. Okay, so that's kind of my way of approaching pantographs is I stitch off the edge of my quilts, and I'm just going to take the wide pantograph and I'm going to cut it off on the edges to fit my client's quilt. Okay, the other thing that I normally do is I try to set up my pantographs so that I have 2 or 3 passes that fit in my throat depth, and then I use the last pass for positioning only. Okay, so that's a little bit of a tip, a little insight into my pantograph class. All right, and then the last thing I want to show you, let's open up one more workspace here. What you're looking at here on the screen is on top is the pantograph that we just talked about. There again, if I select it, you can see that it's been cropped off to fit the width of my client's quilt. But it's also in this version that I have open, it's also been cropped off along the top edge of the quilt so that I don't have any unquilted space at the top. And I do that by using a combination of area and alignment when I actually am ready to stitch. Okay, so my basic tip for you is think about starting with 2 or 3 pantographs that you love, that you go to a lot. Work with your simulation and set up those pantographs so that they're ready for you. Save them on a jump stick or a flash drive, and then next time you go to use that pantograph, it's going to be ready for you. Now, my only piece of advice is to be a little bit careful about that top first pass of your pantograph. Okay, I set up an area, I go ahead and I adjust the pattern so that it's outside of the area box. Just think about that for a second. I just take that pattern and I nudge it outside of the area box so that I get my cropped edge. Okay, and then I do some stitching, and then I go back and I always use the master pantograph to stitch the rest of my quilt. Okay, so this was meant to be just a really quick kind of get you thinking outside of the box and maybe think about setting up pantographs slightly differently than maybe you do every day in your studio. I find that this method for me works really well. It helps me just speed things along here in my studio. If you follow me, you know I'm a very busy quilter. And so any steps that I can do to make my life, easier and for my job to go quicker, then that is one of the main things that I use simulation for. Okay, so if you want the full-on class for my best practices for pantographs, we talk about this in that class. We talk about connecting the pantographs end to end so that you can stitch in both directions. We talk about offset pantographs, and we talk about setting up pantographs that are actually meant to fit a specific space on a quilt where you don't want to do as much cropping. Okay, and then after the Pantos section, it kind of leads into my layout and rendering sessions. So if you're new to the page, it's one of the reasons why I wanted to hop on with this video today is because I do have some new followers and I've been seeing some questions and they're looking for my videos and other people are recommending my classes. I truly appreciate when those of you who have taken my classes recommend me and give me those shout outs. I truly appreciate that. So for any of the new people who haven't done any of my instruction, just hop on over to mkquilts.com. Go on top to the video training store and then go ahead and look through all of my video offerings. I have videos recorded in both Pro Stitcher Standard and Pro Stitcher Premium, and I'm working on some additional classes and just keep your eyes open for that. And if you have any other questions, I welcome you to reach out to me. I'll help when I can. Make sure to check out all the YouTube content and then the videos that I just mentioned on MK Quilts. Keep following here on the page, and I appreciate that as well.
Still small voice cries out to my soul.
So there you have it. This was pretty much kind of a talking through rather than a working through type of a video. But when I was doing this quilt the other day, I just thought, you know, this is how I always approach pantographs, and I want you guys to maybe think outside of the box a little bit. And so I thought this one would be a perfect one to just kind of show you what I saw when I first opened it and how I approached setting it, cropping it, and stitching it. So this quilt behind me is finished. It's ready to go to its owner. I got her permission to use it in this video, and it's just beautiful. This quilt belongs to a friend of mine. She used to be in my quilt guild, but she's not anymore. And when she called me and said she had a quilt, I was just happy to hear that she was still quilting. And then she showed up with it. I asked, what do you want on the quilt as far as quilting? And she said hearts. And I love heart patterns. So the pattern I used on this was called Love Doodles. So you guys use your simulator to help you set up especially designs like pantographs. You can sit at night in your comfy clothes on your sofa, and you can just get that sim running and set up your pantographs so that when you're ready to stitch, they're ready to go. All right, you guys, until next time, from my studio to yours, happy quilting. Bye-bye.